Okay, I'm going to first, before passing it off to Angelina, I want to thank Denise McDonald and Eden Friesen from the West Central Women's Resource Center. Denise is also on the Gathering Design team, a crew of community folks who have helped conceive of and think about the gathering for their support in organizing this panel and learning session today. It gives me a great pleasure to introduce someone I met recently, but really have admired their work from afar, is Angelina Pelletier. Born and raised in Treaty 1 territory, Angelina is a passionate community advocate and specializes in educating and empowering young people with a focus on systemic discrimination. She's a systems navigator and program manager at an Indigenous youth serving organization, Ndinawemaaganag and Ndinawaaad. And as a daughter, auntie, and mother, family is what grounds Angelina both in her work and identity, and is her biggest motivator in executing systemic change. You can check out Angelina's full bio in our program website, as well as the other panelists. So Angelina, thanks so much for agreeing to moderate today, and I'll pass it off to you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for having me here today, and thank you to everyone who's participating. As Michael said, my name is Angelina Pelletier. Good morning. Thank you for being here. I also wanted to add to Michael's acknowledgement that our water here in Treaty 1 is sourced from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation. So we have a few ground rules to cover. I recognize engagement is a little challenging using Zoom and different virtual platforms, but I really appreciate everyone for coming here today and just acknowledging some of the vulnerability that we're all putting into the conversation. So we do have some ground rules here for the session. They should be in front of you on the screen. And I'll just go through them really quickly. And if you do have any that you'd like to add, please, feedback is welcome. You can put it into the chat function and we can add anything to the ground rules. So first, we ask that we please give every person in the session the space and permission to be honest, direct, respectful, and vulnerable. Again, acknowledging that we're existing in a space of vulnerability, we ask that you please have your camera turned on for the entirety of the session to both encourage openness of ourselves and of each other. And we also ask that you please recognize and acknowledge that colonialism has led to racism and racial discrimination, and that Black, Indigenous, and people of color, or BIPOC community, have historically been viewed as colonized peoples and continue to suffer the consequences of colonization. I just got a message from someone, if you don't have a camera, it's all good. We know that there are different barriers to accessibility, so it's all good, don't worry about it. We'd also want to acknowledge that in order for us as a community to learn and move forward, we must be open to change and differing perspectives, as I'm hoping we'll hear here today. I'd also ask that you please be mindful of the time frame provided for the session. We're here till 12:30 today. It's just after 11:09 now. So we have to kind of get deep in a short amount of time. So being conscious of the time, we ask that questions be reserved to the breakout sessions, and that will be happening at about 11:50. Again, if we can all please practice empathy and compassion to the experiences and feelings of others, it's greatly appreciated. Is there anything that I'm missing that you'd like to see added to the list? You can share it in the chat. Great. Okay, well, I'm going to get into it. So we have a number of panelists here today with us to really discuss some of the important work that they're undertaking in the community beyond solidarity statements. So this applies to both community-based organizations and social enterprises. And also following this morning's discussions, we'll break out into a few groups, like I mentioned, to discuss some tangible takeaways from today's session that we can implement in our communities. So before diving in, I'd like to introduce our panelists today. We have Rhonda Thompson, Ella Taylor, Chimwemwe, and Dorota. I'm going to ask you to pronounce your name because I don't want to mess it up.
Blumczynska.
Blumczynska, thank you. Thank you so much for that. If you could, I'd just like the panelists to introduce themselves and talk about a bit of the work that they're involved with in the community. I'll start with Rhonda.
Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Rhonda Thompson. I am the treasurer for both the Black History Month Celebration Committee as well as the Congress of Black Women in Manitoba. We intake a large number of the community members and provide them with volunteer opportunities to be involved in community engagement. As many of you might know, in Canada, we celebrate Black History Month in February. So a lot of our programming revolves around that. In the recent years, though, we've tried to expand that because we've identified the gap in education within the school system. So one of our larger mandates for the last couple of years has been to try and get more Black historical information into the school system. So I know that I see a large number of participants today, so I'm hoping that's one of the initiatives that the community might engage us in getting more of the information in their school systems. So parents, stay tuned. As well, the Congress does a lot of advocacy work for Black women in our community. So again, we look to the community and look forward to that engagement as well.
Thank you. Ella, pass it to you.
Hi, I'm the programs assistant at Daniel McIntyre St. Matthew's Community Association. So I work mostly in like outreach and harm reduction. And I'm also an organizer with Justice for Black Lives Winnipeg. So I'm guessing a lot of you have heard of us. Yeah, we're doing a lot of different stuff right now. Excited to, talk a little bit more about that. And I'm also a founding member of the Black Student Union at U of W. And I'm an Aquarius.
Thank you, Ella. Dorota, go ahead. Oh, you're still on mute. There we go.
Oh, never fails. Good morning. So where to begin? I am presently the executive director of the Immigrant and Refugee Community Organization of Manitoba, fondly known as IRCOM, which many of you know is a safe, affordable transitional housing facility that provides programs and services to recently arrived refugee families for their first 3 years in Canada. I am also the president of the Canadian Council for Refugees, which is a national advocacy group for the rights of refugees and vulnerable migrants within Canada and abroad. And personally, I arrived in Canada 31 years ago as a privately sponsored refugee. So I have the experience of migration and displacement, and believe that that means I have a significant role to play in conversations that create inclusive communities and communities of belonging.
Thank you, Dorota. Okay, so welcome again. I'm really excited to hear from everybody in today's conversation. I did kind of want to set the tone and try as hard as we can to kind of think back to the world a year ago, and kind of some of the changes that have happened in the last year and kind of where we are now since 2020 started. I'd then ask you to kind of go even further back, about 101 years ago, to 1919. It's a bit of a history buff, but the Winnipeg General Strike happened in June 1919, and it was the largest strike in Canadian history. The strike resulted in a number of arrests, injuries, and the deaths of 2 protesters. So that was really pivotal in Canadian history, and it set the tone. And it wasn't immediate that there was success in empowering workers and improving job conditions, but it did unite the working class, who were a largely immigrant population. And it did also help to establish the new Democratic Party that we have here in Parliament today. So very important momentum that came from that strike. Now I'm thinking back to a rally that Ella had mentioned, a Justice for Black Lives rally that happened in June 5th of this year, 2020. That strike was a rally, whatever you want to call it, a protest. It was really pivotal in the movement, I think, here in Winnipeg and Manitoba and the larger communities, Brandon, Portage la Prairie, Steinbach even, just to kind of open up an old wound, maybe that hasn't quite healed, but something that Canadians aren't often ready to talk about. and that's racism, especially against Black, Indigenous, people of color, those populations, kind of those who've been marginalized and othered. So that Justice for Black Lives rally was really huge in my short life here on Earth. And I think it really played a huge role in other social movements that came about in our community since then, especially amidst this global public health emergency that we're all experiencing and living through. So we're familiar with the Black Lives Matter movement. I hope everyone here is a little bit at least familiar with it. And thinking of some of those lives that were lost, not only this year, last year, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, and how impactful that history is and how it sets the tone for our present time right now. So a lot of the questions that we're gonna kind of ask here, pose, get you to think about today is what's working in terms of solidarity and allyship. What has worked? How are we being allies in our day-to-day lives, organizationally, at a community, at a governmental level? I think we all play different roles in our lives. And I'm really curious to know why everyone's here today. What do we want to come out of this session? I think we all might have some expectations or just here to learn, and that's great too. But throughout the session, I'm going to ask, we don't have enough time for everyone to introduce themselves, but if you could use the chat function and just include maybe one word that comes to mind when you think of allyship or anti-racism work in your community and our greater community that is the world. You can use the chat function and maybe we'll get someone to kind of write these all down and we can create this big Wordle or something. I don't know how, we can't flip chart on Zoom, I don't think, so I'm not as equipped with some tools for note-taking. But I'm just gonna kind of dive into the questions. We have 30 minutes for questions to our panelists, Rhonda, Ella, and Dorota. So I really want to be mindful of that time and try to share space as best as we can. The questions that I have are really big questions. I'm not expecting answers to each of them, but I just kind of spark some thoughts and really get to know your position and work that you've been doing that we can maybe implement in our communities. So I talked a bit about the past and the present. So reflecting on the year 2020 so far, what impact did the Justice for Black Lives rally or Black Lives Matter movement, what did that mean to you and how did that impact or influence your work in your community? What do you think motivated Manitobans to gather in this way as they did over 100 years ago, especially again, during a global health pandemic? I guess we'll start with Rhonda. We'll kind of go in that order. Rhonda, did you want to answer?
Yes, sure. So I know 2020 has been one of those really crazy years, and I think what we've definitely focused on of late is the negative. And I think what the rally has sparked within our community since June was a sense of unity. So when the pandemic hit, everything shut down, and I think our eyes and our ears became more aware of what was going on and what was being spoken, we were seeing. So because everybody was home, we were able to see for our very eyes some of the different events that are happening, especially down in the States. So I think it triggered within our community a need for us to come together and have a unified response. So the Black Community Collective was formed at the end of May, and it identified a number of leaders within our community, and we engaged in the practice of getting together and forming a unified response that was to be released just prior to the rally. So there was wonderful, amazing organizers putting together the rally. And so we wanted to support them and find a way to bring a voice that would kind of stand behind them as well and beside them. And so we had put that together and put out a response. It was a way for us to grieve even as a community and be able to engage with one another and be able to bring our words to the forefront in a way that we weren't able to do before. So it was closed to response, and we were just able to put our information out there. It was very, very well received from the community, and I'm hoping that it helped to spark individuals to come out to the rally as well. The rally itself was so powerful so moving, so engaging, and it was just it was almost like attending a funeral, like a mass memorial in a way. And I think that for myself, it sparked within me a need for me to come out and get out and do more and find other creative ways to get people involved. So the Black Community Collective went about setting up some town hall meetings, and within the talks that we had there, we realized that allyship was going to be important. And then that's when we started to engage with different community organizations. And actually, Dorota who's one of the panelists today, her and I are part of the Police Accountability Coalition. And I think we can probably speak to more of that in our transformational and future talks, but that's where my thoughts were.
Thank you, Rhonda. I'll pass it to Ella now to answer the same questions.
Hi. So I feel like I'm still processing the rally and the influence it's had on me and my communities and my work. It still feels like super surreal. I don't know that any of us expected it to be as big as it was and for it to go as well as it did. Like the morning of, I was like in Walmart buying jugs of milk because we were like seriously afraid we were going to be pepper sprayed. And I was writing a lawyer's phone number on my arm in Sharpie in case we got arrested, and like trying not to have a panic attack because there was like such genuine fear that those things might happen. And I think we were all just trying to be so prepared for like the absolute worst things that could happen that like I wasn't even expecting, you know, what could happen if it went as well as it did. So it's been like interesting to try and I guess accept that. And one of the biggest things that I felt like it really taught me was that you can ask for what you need and then have faith that the community is going to provide it. And anytime we've asked for anything, whether that's supplies or support or, you know, people's physical presence or whatever, like people have always been there to supply that for us. So I think like people are ready, and like if you just tell people what to do, they'll do it. Like people are here and they're willing to do the work, and maybe just need a little bit of guidance in doing that. And I think a big part of that is being as accessible as possible and just trying to cover every base that you can possibly think of. Like for the first rally, we had seating at the front, we had ASL interpreters, we had handy transit, we had live streaming, we had hand sanitizer and masks and gloves and food and water, and we were just trying to like think of literally everything that we could to have as few barriers as possible for people coming, and we're trying to continue to do that as much as we can with future events. But yeah, I definitely feel like there have been a lot of, you know, movements or groups, organizations that have kind of popped up since the rally, and I hope that they were partially inspired by it, and like maybe all they really needed was just to be told or shown that it is possible and that people are going to support you. So hopefully, you know, people will take that to heart and go, well, okay, if they did it, then we can do it too. So yeah, and I definitely feel like the pandemic was a huge part of the reason that the rally went the way it did, because I think, you know, being isolated and not being around other people, normally if something like this were going on, we could gather together and grieve together and be in community. And, you know, like when you're just at home all the time, then like it's just so enraging and upsetting and lonely, and you want to be around other Black people, and when you can't do that, then like that's just another level to this whole situation. And I think that the pandemic also really just like hammered home how horrible George Floyd's death was. You know, like there's something really, really heinous about the way that he died in a pandemic that affects your breathing, to watch someone literally be like choked to death. I actually haven't watched the video yet, and I probably won't ever, because like I think people don't take things like that seriously enough. If you witnessed that in real life, like you would have PTSD, you'd be in therapy. Like that's not a normal thing to witness, and that doesn't change just because it's through a camera. And yeah, so I think witnessing something like that, like you need to be able to be with community. So I think that was a huge part of the motivation for gathering, because racism is also a global crisis. So, you know, at that point, being able to be with community and grieve and try and change things was worth the risk at the time.
Thank you, Ella. Sorry, the mute is like very delayed, so I'm not just staring at you blankly or anyone. I appreciate everyone's consideration with our Zoom platform. But that was amazing. I had to light some smudge to kind of keep my spirits up, but I really thank you for sharing and for the work that you've done, Ella. Dorota, I'll pass it to you now.
Thanks. So I'm gonna sort of share what that moment was a bit like for me. I was present at the rally, and I was standing between one of my board members and his entire family and extended family, and then beside my sister-in-law. My sister-in-law is a Tamil from Southeast India, and on the British caste system, she's in the scheduled tribes because of the very dark color of her skin. And the feeling in that space, I think, as Rhonda said, was there was tremendous grief. I also saw community members. I saw tenants from IRCOM. I saw many of IRCOM's friends and partners, and I saw so many of our youth. And what I saw, though, is I saw them both weeping and raising their fists into the air. And so there was tremendous sadness, but there was so much power. And it was understood that this is a fight, and it isn't a fight that began that day. It is a fight that's been going on for so long. And I think part of the reason that so many Manitobans came out is because we're beginning to understand that inactions and silence makes us complicit. Those of us who are white and who do not have the experience of racism don't actually have the option of sitting out. And you know, a lot of the discussions have been centered around, you know, needing to learn and needing to listen. And in so many ways, I think learning and listening is really over. If we still need to hear the trauma and the suffering of fellow human beings as evidence that we are perpetuating injustice and harm against one another, then, you know, that's a massive failure of humanity. In our community, you know, there was so much emotion that we found ourselves coming to work each and every day. Those of us who were still on site with our families and crying and feeling so powerless and feeling so angry and really feeling like these things are allowed to happen because no one is fighting against them. And I think, you know, that's part of the reason that we we joined, Rhonda and others in the Police Accountability Coalition. It was for the very reason that, I don't want this kind of world. I don't want this world for any of the people that I love in my life. I don't want this world for my children. And I also realized that everything that we are doing, we have taught and perpetuated by design and on purpose. We've created these conditions, and the pandemic, that's a health condition that, we can physically distance, we can remove ourselves, we can get vaccines, we can, get past this health pandemic. We are not going to get past the pandemic of systemic racism unless we actually fight it with the same intentionality, the same focus, the same policy interventions, the same institutional interventions, the same dismantling as we are forcing onto the health pandemic. Yeah.
Thank you, Dorota. Thank you for sharing your perspective. I think especially as a newcomer, like you mentioned, to Canada, you also have a unique perspective to add to the conversation. So I appreciate that. That was really heavy. I know that Michael had let everyone know we do have a care team. So if you're at any time feeling triggered or a little, unable to participate or even listen to some of the commentary or some of the stories that we're sharing today, I'd really invite you to reach out to the care team or even just let someone know in the chat. I see that a few people had to step away to take some phone calls. So just making sure that everyone's in the same space virtually. We're going to get into our next question. Sorry, I closed my other screen with the questions. And okay. So we're also going to be looking at the future and then another transformational piece. But I'd like to ask, again, to each panelist, thinking of all the solidarity statements that numerous people and organizations have put out this year, what are some tangible actions that are necessary to move our communities forward? And what does anti-racist solidarity work look and feel like to you and your communities? And how can solidarity really be implemented in an authentic and genuine way into practice and our policy organizationally?
So I guess I'll start. I think for myself, when I see and read and hear those solidarity statements, I'll be honest, the first thing I think of is I get frustrated because I'm thinking, oh, now you're doing it. Oh, okay, yeah, now it's the in thing to do. So now everybody's on board. But then I also think back, I'm like, you know what? My parents have been here for a number of years, and I know that this isn't the first time that these issues have come to light. And when I have conversations with them, they're very, they have no faith in the fact that there's going to be any action taken on this. They're, they've kind of thrown their hands up and they're saying, you know what, if you have the energy to do it now, you guys, you young people, get out there and pound the pavement and get it done. We've tried, and the steps that they were taking, it was like they were trudging through mud when they got here because nobody had ever walked the path that they were trying to walk. So we're walking in the path that they've already tread for us. So it should be easier for us to do. And so that motivates me to continue to do the work. But I hope that these companies know how how fortifying the statements can be if there's action behind it. So statements are wonderful, but action is amazing. So that's what we just kind of sit back and watch to see. We want to be involved though in the creation of policies. We want to be involved in the conversations that are being had, because if you don't know what individuals are going through, how would you ever fix or help to fix the problems? So it's so important for individuals that are at those boardroom tables to bring in the voices that need to be heard, that have not been heard for so many years. So I think in looking forward, I think that's where we need to start the conversation. This kind of a conversation is great because we don't know what boardrooms and what conversations and what workplaces and the spaces that every one of you are involved in. So each one of you have a role to play in taking this information, going back and saying, we've heard, we know that they want to be a part of the conversation. So let's include them and find creative ways to do it. I've heard, oh, well, we can't meet, we'll meet when the pandemic is over. Listen, this is the new norm. Let's get used to this virtual reality that we're in and use these spaces like organizations like CCEDNet have done. Like we've been doing and meeting and speaking to everybody virtually. So let's get the work done and stop using excuses on how we're waiting for the perfect time. The perfect time is today. The perfect setting is whatever you make it to be.
Yeah, I definitely agree with all of that. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go for it, Ella. There's a delay.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that I think what people just have to understand is that you just have to be persistent and dedicated and just really commit and try and be consistent with that, because like solidarity is not like a destination that you arrive at and then you get off the train and that's it. Like it's continuous and it doesn't end. And so I think something really important for like organizations is that everyone has to have both a personal and collective sense of responsibility, and it needs to be like brought into like your mandate and your mission as an organization. And then also each individual person needs to understand and hopefully be working on it in their own personal life as well. But you have to make it so that it's bigger than any one specific team of people. So if you all, quit the next day, it still has to be part of the organization. So the new people coming on are still going to work on it. And in order to keep doing that, like, you're not going to be perfect. No one is going to be perfect. Everyone's going to make mistakes, but it's really important to not just be defensive, just be open and be willing to engage. And I think that kind of attitude is really just going to be the best possible way to be, because when you're really defensive, people do not like that. Like there's an art gallery in Winnipeg that's been having issues like for at least a year, probably longer. And I think their executive director was on Instagram in the comments on a post, like being super defensive with people commenting, saying their issues with the gallery, which is, in my opinion, unprofessional, but also just, making it clear you're not listening to people and you're not taking them seriously because you just want to brush it off and, keep your like reputation intact. Like give up on the reputation, because if you just engage with people and you work on it together and you listen to the people who are affected, then that will become part of your reputation. And, like you're just not going to have a pristine image, but like this is bigger than that. So yeah, I think ways that we can continue to work on that in organizations, always prioritize Black and Indigenous people, like always. I think a lot of organizations really need to step it up when it comes to Black people. Not to say that this is enough or not to speak for Indigenous people, but there's a lot of organizations that will say, you know, we encourage Indigenous and racialized people to apply. Like, people need to be specific and say Black people as well. We're not just people of color. Like, we have a very distinct experience and we can't just be lumped in. So when you mean Black, you need to say Black. And pay BIPOC. Like, don't lowball BIPOC people. Don't ask for free labor. Pay them for their labor. And, you know, if you're building a policy about racial justice, pay BIPOC to consult with you. And hire BIPOC in your workplaces, and ask how you can support them, and be really honest about the racial dynamics that exist currently. Like, in an interview, you should be telling people how many people of color you have working there, how many specifically Black people and Indigenous people and people of color, and be honest about how many white people are there. And if you know there have been incidents at your organization in the past of like blatant racism, then warn them about that. Don't just throw them in blind into a situation that might put them in danger. And I have been asked in an interview, okay, like, here are the situations we've had in the past. How would you respond if you were in that situation? Well, it shouldn't be about how I'm going to respond. It should be, what are you going to do to support me in that situation? So have a plan for how you're going to support Black and Indigenous people if they are going to experience racism in your workplace. And when you're hiring BIPOC, you have to understand how insidious racism really is. Like, you really have to check yourself to see if you're judging BIPOC applicants more harshly than you would judge a white person in an interview. You need to watch out for respectability politics and like decorum and like things like that. You know, watch if you'd accept an underqualified white person when you wouldn't accept a qualified BIPOC person. And it doesn't just stop at racism. Like, you can't just check a box and be like, okay, now we have a person of color or whatever. Also, like, really, really watch for colorism, and, you know, don't just accept white passing people to check off your quota of BIPOC people to hire. Like, you need to also make sure that you're hiring dark-skinned people and elevating their voices, because they are, you know, the most important voices to center.
Thank you, Ella. Dorota, I'll let you go ahead.
Thanks. Okay, so to follow up on what Ella has shared, so I think first and foremost, I want to also say that it's really important to believe people. When someone tells you that something has happened, and speaking as a white person, it is really important to not question whether or not racism was experienced by the person who experienced it. Empathy has limits. We can be incredibly empathetic, and we will never have that lived experience. And there's a world of difference between empathy and lived experience. So to exercise extreme caution when having that sense of trying to understand or feeling like you understand what the other person might be experiencing, because that's not the case. I think systems change is important, but systems change has to be so intentional. There has to be almost systemic skepticism every single time you look at a policy. And beyond just policy language, there has to be matrix and data and evidence. So there's a lot. I would caution when you hire under that guise of diversity, and so it's all of your frontline staff that are Black or Indigenous or people of color, you know, and fewer represented in management and even less in senior management and executive positions. The other piece is that you take apart your whole entire salary spending and you look at, again, disaggregated race data and see, what proportion of people are white and what proportion of earnings are earned by the white people, by the Indigenous people, the Black people, and the people of color. So you take a look at that, because that is hard evidence that then points to things. Ella said it so strongly in terms of hiring. The answer of this person is not a good fit is an extremely dangerous answer in hiring practices. You have to be able to articulate why exactly someone is not a good fit, because the affinity bias, or the bias towards someone who looks like you or sounds like you or has a shared narrative with you, is very, very powerful. And it really discounts and disqualifies other people. So extreme caution in doing that. The other piece is looking at whose experience and whose voices and whose worldview is reflected within policies. So as an example, Manitoba employment standards recognize, Good Friday and Christmas Day as statutory paid holidays, not Eid or Rosh Hashanah or other faiths and celebrations. As a point of policy change, IRCOM went to the employment standards and said, do we have as an employer the option to create any other day that is a reflection of whomever says this is an important day to me, and the law doesn't allow for that. So the law is centered around that the Christian white settler narrative. What do you as an organization do? You create additional statutory holidays that are at the discretion of each and every single person to place on the days that is a reflection of their values, and you make that a protected day. That has a cost, but justice always has a cost. And we're looking for ways to try and create systemic change that's somehow cost neutral. Well, it's not going to be cost neutral. You have to put your money where your mouth is. And you do have to hold people accountable. Again, like respectful workplace policies are very, very dangerous. They're extremely important, but if someone is a bigot or a racist, you fire. There's no training out of that. There's no, helping people have increased exposure or asking them to sit at the table with their colleagues who then tell them their experiences of racism, and that's somehow going to enlighten them and change their worldview. Like there's a right and there's a wrong. And when there is a wrong, this is where being complicit comes in. This is where privilege has such a way of blinding people that you think to yourself, well, maybe if we have a few more conversations, we're going to get past this. And that automatically creates a space that is not safe for everyone, because you've now sheltered. You've sheltered the racism and you've sheltered the bigotry. And that is something you do conscientiously. And I do feel that leaders have a tremendous responsibility to work hard and look hard for hardships, and especially to check themselves. The lived experiences that we have give us the worldview that we have, right? And I think where, my lived experience of migration may be similar to the migration experiences of others, or being a refugee, or living in poverty, or being a child in the child welfare system, or experiencing violence from police as a youth. All of that, yes, those will be narratives or parallel pathways that I may be sharing with other people. But my experience of the world, and perhaps more importantly, the world's experience of me, is always going to be through my whiteness. And whiteness is a tremendous privilege that alleviates the impacts of every single circumstance. It is simply not the same. And it's really important to understand it's not the same, but then work at systemic change, systemic policy-based change that does not rely on the individual or someone's saviorship, someone's charity complex, somebody's, I want to be a good person complex. This is a matter of justice, and justice has to be written into policy, into legislation.
Thank you, Dorota. Thank you for your perspective. Sorry, I'm a little bit distracted. I realize we're at our time mark for our breakout groups. I did want to, I shared the questions in the chat for all to see, but I did want to go over the transformational question because I think that's probably the most important one of this discussion today, and kind of where are we going to next? What's going to happen when we leave the session today, when we go home, or I guess most of us are home right now, but when we go into our communities and get to work. So those questions are based around decolonization. And that's something that is like the hot word right now. How do we decolonize our minds, our communities? But I'd really like to invite all of you to think of how are we planning to decolonize our communities and extinguish racism. I've heard a lot of people saying like, we need to stop racism and, we need to, put a patch over it so it's not so ugly for us to see. But I really want to think about a world without discrimination and without racism, and how we can achieve that by working together and coming together, as Ella beautifully highlighted with the rally this year. It was really community coming together, and that's really what made the biggest impact. So decolonizing our minds, our behaviors, our systems from a community scale to a global scale is super important. We recognize that racism exists and that violence is existing and people are dying. And it's been happening for many centuries. And I feel like we're now in a place where we have the momentum, we're having conversations, people are making statements. What steps do we need to take to move the agenda forward and our communities forward together? So I don't know if we should take that question, just move into our breakout groups, how comfortable you all are with that. We have a bit of planning. We kind of had to plan on the fly in terms of how many participants would be in our session today. And I really wanted to keep the breakout groups to like a max of 12 because I find that'll create the most genuine discussion. I don't want everyone to get lost. So we have about 122 participants today, which is amazing. So if we could break out into 10 groups, we'll have 3 panelists, myself, a moderator, and then we'll also have Eden, one of the planners. Then I'm gonna put a bit of a call out to our participants, 5 in total, who's comfortable leading a conversation. If you could maybe put in the chat, if you're comfortable, or put something in your name to kind of indicate that you're comfortable leading this kind of conversation to talk about some tangible takeaways so that we can come together at the end of the discussion and share those takeaways with the larger group, and really leave today's session ready to get to work. Do we have any participants who are comfortable leading? We need 5 volunteers. Anyone at all? Holly, okay, thank you, Holly. Holly's volunteered herself. Thank you so much. 4 more, can I have 4 more people who are open to leading this important discussion? Marianne, awesome, thank you, Marianne. You're gonna be great. And who else? Ariel, thank you, Ariel. Anthony, thank you, Anthony. So we just need one more volunteer to help lead a discussion. Going once. No. Edgy, is that a yes? No, okay. I'm not sure if we have, Michelle, thank you, Michelle. Okay, so we have 5. We have a lovely participant manager named Hannah. She's going to divide all of the participants into our groups. So we'll have 10 groups. We're going to talk for about 15 minutes or so, as organized as we can. And then we will come back to the larger group and share some of our thoughts.
Thanks, Angelina. I'm just going to add one more accessibility note that if folks require ASL or closed captioning, if you can just rename yourself, and you do that by right-clicking your own picture, pressing rename and putting ASL at the beginning of your name, then we'll ensure that you're in the group where ASL and closed captioning services will still be provided. So if you can just give a moment too for our amazing person who's making these breakout groups happen, as folks who've been on Zoom before know, it just takes a minute to get that in place. So that's great. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. I will add, we talked before this session happened. If you're in a breakout group, you can't message someone who's not in the breakout group privately. So our care team will be going to each group. If you need to talk to our care team, you can message them directly when you find them in your breakout group. And thank you again to Michelle, Marianne, Ariel, Anthony, and Holly.
Hudson was killed very shortly, I think, after. And so it's, you know, I think that all of those things really brought it home that it's not just happening somewhere else, it's happening here.
Absolutely.
I would echo that the rally was really sort of an eye-opener for the greater community, that it's very much an at-home thing. It's not just far away. We all know that we suffer terribly from systemic racism, but it's not until you see people on the streets in those numbers that you realize how many people in our community are affected. Yeah, it just brings it out into the open, and that's why those events are so important, and mostly because it gets conversations started. And it's like the climate justice rally in 2019. Like all of a sudden we had 15,000 people on the streets, and it just seemed to become so much more part of everyday conversation, and that's part of the healing to figure out how to go forward.
Perfect.
For me, I guess there's a couple of things. I have two younger kids at home, 8 and 7, and watching the videos and hearing the interviews with people affected, I struggled with it, trying to understand age appropriateness and all that kind of stuff, but chose to do that, and it was hard. And to try and understand it through their eyes is so interesting, because it's at some level you realize they can't comprehend why something like that would exist in this world. And on the other hand, you just have such raw emotion and passion that needs to stop. And so it led to some really emotional conversations at home, as they very quickly kind of transpose that experience to their friends at school and friends of the family who they realize look like the people who are being hurt and killed. The rally itself, incredibly inspiring to see so many people there, and incredibly painful to realize where it's all coming from. Disappointing to see not as many older people or white people at the rally as I would have hoped would show up as a statement. But like Dorota was saying, I mean, seeing some of my friends from IRCOM, for example, leading with inspiration, conviction, and power was just incredible. And to be there and to stand in solidarity, but to just experience was incredible.
Yeah, absolutely. And mind you, this is during a global health pandemic, so they're actually risking themselves for that cause. So it's actually amazing to see what they're willing to put themselves in for a cause they care about, you know what I mean? And that was very powerful, Brendan. Very powerful answer.
My daughter is biracial. Her father is Jamaican, and you know, all of these things have always brought it very close to home for me.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I mean, it's, you know, I have been an ally. I mean, the people that I am closest to in life are people of color, Indigenous people. Like those are the people that I'm truly consider family. And, you know, watching how my daughter who refused to watch the video because she knew the trauma that it would inflict, but watching the trauma that was there anyway. And in fact, recently, she had signs up in her apartment window. She lived in West Broadway, and she left in early November to go stay with her father's family for 6 months in Jamaica. But shortly before she moved, she had had signs up for a long time in her window. One of them said "Justice for Aisha Harper." The other one was a little less polite. It it said "Abolish the pigs." Her landlord made her take them down, but she made a comment on social media about it, and so they evicted her 4 days before she left. And so she couldn't fight it. And you know, it goes to show that here they're saying, you know, they're posting, or they sent her a letter, you know, with, I don't know if it was their rental policy, like I don't know what it was, or if it's actually something in the Residential Tenancies Act where they're not allowed to hang anything from the outside of the building or the outside of the window, which she was not doing. So I mean, she was just not in a space to be able to deal with it for 4 days before she left. But part of what made her choose to go and be with her family for a long period of time is that she felt she can't be here anymore. She feels that she is not okay, that she is being told on a daily basis that who and what she is wrong, and based mostly on the color of her skin.
Wow, Aileen. Aileen, sorry, my bad again. It's my fault. That was extremely powerful. I really appreciate you sharing that with us. And sharing that experience, and you have a stake in it, obviously. So,
yeah. Well, I know a lot of people who have been mistreated by, I mean, you know, police violence in particular, but just many other instances of systemic racism.
Absolutely.
And it's hard to see that happen to people that you love and that you care about. So it is very close to home, yeah.
Does anyone else want to share anything on the first question here?
For myself, I am Indigenous, so I know about racism. And when Black Lives Matter, I mean, that was an uproar. It was about time because it's so hidden. Like, people are just starting to talk about it now, but it was hidden. People are too scared to say anything because, you know, just like the news yesterday, with that woman passing away in Quebec, and then people coming forward and talking about their own experiences and that. I mean, that's powerful in itself because it's not just Indigenous, it's everyone else out there is experiencing it, and now they're talking about it, which is powerful. But the thing has to come,
awesome.
that it has to change at the policy level though, because it's never going to change if we don't get the policies out there and get the politicians start working for us.
I appreciate that. That's I agree with that. Sorry, Aileen, my fault.
No, that's okay. Go ahead, Lori.
I would just like dovetail off what Tammy just shared, that I think for me, tying sort of the first and third questions together was how did it impact my work? I mean, I think personally it impacted me in all kinds of ways, but it was really clear to me, and has been for a while, but I think that the Black Lives Matter rally in the city really brought it right to the forefront of my mind that as an organization, as a non-Indigenous organization that serves a large percentage of Indigenous people and other people of color, that we really needed to take seriously not just the words that we put out. We shied away from issuing a solidarity statement, not because we don't stand in solidarity, but we really wanted to make sure that we were doing the work before we issued any kind of position on our solidarity. So what we've done, and I guess sort of speaking a bit towards question number 3 around transformation, is we're in the process now of doing a deep dive into our organizational policies and practices. And we're doing that in partnership with about 8 other community agencies that we see as leaders in the sector: Indigenous-led agencies, newcomer-led agencies, queer-led agencies. And we're really bringing together some folks who I think are progressive in their thinking and willing to challenge typical narratives around human resources and hiring practices and policies and things like that. And we're working together to create a shared human resources strategy that can be used for the sector, so that we can deeply embed anti-racism work into our narrative and focusing our policies and practices on decolonization, on queer inclusiveness, on a feminist perspective, and then hopefully once we're completed that work, we can offer it to other agencies that might be interested also in looking at what we've produced together. And so that for me was the takeaway: was it wasn't enough to just show up. That was important, but the work had to be deeper than that. And I think that's where we're left now, and that work lies ahead still, but our commitment to it is very, very strong right now.
Wow, thanks, Lori. Very insightful. Everyone here is really insightful. I really like all your guys' responses. Very engaging. You guys have a lot to say. Is everyone ready to move on to question 2?
We have, I think, 1 minute left.
Oh, 1 minute left? Oh, my bad. We spent a lot of time on the question.
We did, but we crossed
it was good.
into other areas as well, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what do we, we have 1 minute now.
Oh, there we go. 58 seconds. Yeah.
Does anyone have something to say about number 2 in 52 seconds?
See how fast you guys can talk.
Only that I guess I'm really interested in to find out how, like the work, Lori, that you're doing, how we could partner that with the groups like Community Not Cut and Manitoba Energy Justice Coalition and the community groups that are trying to work politically and are grappling with ways to be more inclusive. So I'm wondering if there's a way to connect at some point. We don't have the resources necessarily to do all the back work, even though we have lots of people very sensitive and engaged in the trying to figure out how to move forward.
Yeah, we'll try and share as soon as we have a document that's worth sharing.
Of what we're going to be sharing. So maybe message me privately and I'll add that to the notes. Sorry again for pressing the wrong button.
Angelina, I think we're all back from breakout rooms now.
Okay, great. Welcome back, everyone. I hope that went okay. I found it a bit awkward at times, like trying to have conversations around these really heavy subjects. I hope it was productive. And thank you again to our volunteers for leading those conversations. That's a huge job. And as our first session today, this is a lot of work that I wasn't really familiar with before. So I appreciate your grace that you're giving me today and this morning. And again, thank you to our lovely panelists here sharing some of their thoughts and experiences with everyone. So I think we had about 10 breakout groups. I wanted to review some of the takeaways that we've had from our breakout groups today. So technology-wise, I think someone will take care of our volunteer facilitators who led their conversations, but maybe if we could just go through the panelists. We'll start with Rhonda to talk about some of the takeaways that you have from your group's breakout session.
Okay, so in my group, they were very engaging, really great. Thank you very much. I know we got cut off at the very end, so I wanted to say thank you all for being so open and honest and willing to share. So a couple of things that they had identified that due to, because of the events and actions that we've seen of late, there's been some awareness training that's come about in some organizations. Some spots have been opened up on boards that are exclusively set aside for people of color. Some conversations have been sparked in their workplaces and committees to engage in identifying how they can make changes to their policies and procedures. And there was a note that sometimes these changes are met with resistance. So we were talking about doing metric reporting and having individuals identifying their demographics and so that they can identify who's representing where and looking at those things. And some people are resistant to providing that information. And the suggestion would be to maybe have some expanded conversation on why the reporting is being done, because it's for the benefit of everybody that's sitting at the table. So I think it's not for us to know your business. It's for us to be able to identify where we can make changes to policies and procedures. So that's what we took away from my amazing group.
Thank you, Rhonda. I'll pass it to Ella Taylor now.
So in my group, we talked about major motivation for doing this kind of work, which for a lot of us was children and, just wanting a better world for our descendants. And we also talked about the importance of education, where the education system is lacking, and how education, it's never too early for it. We talked about redistributing funds, and we also talked about healing and personal healing. And I was just touching on this as the room closed, but doing this kind of work is part of my healing. And, all of this stems, I think, for most organizers, out of love for our community and being with my community, working for my community, and being able to help my community is healing for me. So I guess melding healing with your work is, another step.
Thank you, Ella. Dorota, go ahead.
That's great. I would add that our conversation sounded somewhat similar in terms of children, education. I mean, really just, I think, Rhonda, you started with this too, in terms of the need to look at curriculum with intentionality and rewriting history, and really just focusing on that truth and more voices and more narratives and just offering an alternative storyline to the world that we share. We talked at length about how there's a lot of hope in children, that children do see differences in people, that children will recognize when someone looks different than them or similar to them, and they'll point that out, but children don't have it built within them that there's a hierarchy to these differences. It's like, seeing the world, but not valuing it and not judging it, and that we tend to put in place that judgment, and normalizing in so many ways in all of our homes conversations around race. And I specifically shared that we probably talk about race in our home every single day. because my kids will say something about a character on TV or themselves or their friend, or, you know, my peach skin or their brown skin. And this isn't, we don't run away from this. We don't hush this. We don't make it seem like this is a taboo subject or unwelcome subject. This is something that, like, we have to go into these conversations and have the conversations of race. And I think especially as white people, we do also have to understand our limitations, right? So we have to understand what we can learn through this experience, but what we cannot experience, right? And as people working in community, limitations extend to that as well, right? So I know a lot of us go into community work because we want to change the world, because we have idealism or altruism or social justice. You know, this is where we want to give our time and skill and talent. Very few, I think, are equipped to deal with post-traumatic stress disorder, to deal with trauma, to deal with intergenerational trauma, to deal with survivors of torture, survivors of war. We're not equipped. And so we have to understand the limits of what we know and kind of the limits of our intentionality, and then make sure that we go at this work with one another, seeking to really understand how to support one another as best as we can.
Thank you, Dorota. Thank you for sharing and for sharing the takeaways. I'll share from my breakout group. And then we've also have the spotlight on our volunteers. We have Marianne. A lot of our takeaways are echoing what you all are saying. We talked about education, you know, from birth to finishing high school, talking about decolonizing with our elders, with our young people, to really make some change. And the importance that language matters, and words like minority and majority, how those have implications that we don't usually think about on a day-to-day. So really unpacking some of that language that we don't think about and changing how we describe people. I'm going to pass it off to Marianne Cirilli. Thank you for volunteering for your group. We'll get you unmuted in a moment, and then you can share some of your takeaways. Thank you. Can you unmute? 1 second.
There we go. I think it worked that time. Yeah, we had a pretty good discussion with a few people. There were some people that were hesitant to speak, and I'm not sure why that was, or if they were there. But one of the big things was talking about replacing yourself if you're not a BIPOC, and being willing to pay the cost for justice was another comment that was made. And really, it starts with educating yourself was a point that was made, and how to educate people to do that. We talked a lot about systems change and how the system is broken, and how our economy is actually based on racism and sexism and other oppressions, and that CED is actually an alternative that we can have as a vision. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that and make space for groups to comment.
Thank you for sharing, Marianne.
Okay.
And for volunteering. We have Holly. Hi, Holly. I'm going to get you unmuted in a second, and then you're able to share some takeaways from your group. There you go.
Yeah, we definitely talked about some of the things mentioned, and then also Michael chimed in to talk about, I guess, when you're going into the future, that involves the policy changes. So educating ourselves in the present about what's going on and being aware of the action. Even rurally, that was something. So social media is helpful because the news isn't often as helpful to get us informed. And that's a way to recognize it at the very least, and then be part of it in some way, to be working towards the future, which involves education, but further, like education of the resources, like how do you do that? And then what else was mentioned? Yeah, just I guess the duality of that, going into the future and then coming back to the present. And then no one really talked about the vision, but hopefully some people were thinking about that. We as well, there was a few people speaking and other people hopefully were, engaged. And then we're gonna all put the power into the vision.
Thank you, Holly. I'll pass it to Ariel.
Yeah.
Thank you for volunteering, Ariel.
Oh, of course. Actually, I guess something I'd like to share was the experience with my group, at least based on what I'm hearing from everyone else, was quite different from the other groups. I found that overall the group was very quiet. So I tried to share some talking points. I shared some of my experiences in the hope that other people would share. But overall, I think what I found was that we had a lot of questions. So it was about kind of what can we do? And I think we agreed on the fact that it's not about just making solidarity statements and talking the talk, but it's also about checking yourself to make sure that your actions match with your intentions. But in terms of concrete examples of that, I think we had more questions than answers. Talked about standing up when you're seeing racism and oppression and supporting people's experiences. We talked about the fact that you have to intentionally create policies with BIPOC in mind, and things like we talked a few times about trying to seize the means of production and find ways to funnel money into the organizations that need it, because too often these organizations have to spend time fundraising, which takes them away from their mission. And there was talk of the fact that policy can fail if it doesn't understand properly, if it's not centered properly around the group that it's targeting. I'm hoping I understood what that person was sharing properly, but basically they said it's more about letting people within the organization explain what their needs are and then empowering them in that direction rather than necessarily having policy. And someone else shared, and something tells me that maybe that was the overall feeling in the group. Someone else shared that they didn't feel like the space was for them and that they were there to listen and support, but that they wanted to kind of stay away from they were just leaving space open. But what I ended up finding was that overall it was pretty quiet. So that is something that I would identify as maybe something we need to work on. Is that it's.
Thank you, Ariel. We also have Sarah. I think she's speaking on behalf of Anthony's group. We're having some technical issues with spotlighting Anthony in the chat here. Hi, Sarah.
Hey. Hi, Angelina. Really quickly, I think we're getting close to the end of our time too. From our group, I thought a really interesting point was there's a couple people that work in a big company, much like, and maybe not from our sector as much, and they talked about how to figure out how to be effective and how to be an agent of change in that kind of position where you're maybe not in leadership of like a much bigger place than you really have a lot of agency in. And so that felt really different. Is it sort of about getting the softballs into people's inboxes and raising the issue when you can, but also balancing it so that you can stay there and be a voice consistently as well to be able to do that. So that's an interesting difference. And for some of us who are in leadership, that there's a different role maybe when you're not in the position of writing policy. And another really one I think that echoes others that have mentioned that there's one person in our room who comes from a country without as many different people, different kinds of people, different demographics, who was really surprised coming here about how many different terms and languages we use to describe these kinds of things, and that sometimes the language we use can actually maybe contribute to creating the barriers themselves. Like I think someone said minority and majority, and what does that really mean? And the other thing I think was just leaning into it, never being complacent. And when you start on this journey, you stay away from complacency and you keep working towards it. You're on a journey. Everyone's at a different spot, and we're all just constantly needing to have that persistent move towards difference and change.
Thank you, Sarah. We have one last person. I know we're out of time. I didn't want to leave Anthony out of the conversation. I don't know if he'll be added. I'm working through text and private messages.
Can you guys hear me?
I can hear Anthony, yes.
Okay, perfect. So I'll just keep this short and sweet because we have to go, or we have to move on, sorry. But I was just really hopeful to hear all your guys' contributions, and my breakout room was extremely communicative, and a lot of them had a stake in this issue, and it was very personal, and they were extremely passionate about discussing these issues. And all I'm going to say is just it's great to see everybody being forward-thinking and progressive and thinking about the future. And yeah, that's about it. I'll just keep it there.
Thank you so much for volunteering your time also, Anthony.
Yeah.
And thank you
no
to
problem.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone who showed up for the very first session on a really busy week. Also Giving Tuesday. So thanks for everyone for giving your time to us today and to talk about this really important conversation on anti-racism.
Thank you so much, Angelina, for so expertly moderating both the discussion and getting us through this in the Zoom world too. So our extreme, heartfelt thank you to you for moderating and for your work, not just today, but throughout the entire year on this work, and to Rhonda and to Ella and Dorota. I think I took 4 full pages of loose leaf notes throughout this entire session with some really important learning. So I want to all try to summarize because they have said it so well. So I really appreciate the 3 of the panelists, and to Eden and Denise from West Central Women's Resource Center who helped in the organizing of this. So that's all for this panel. Just a quick few announcements before we're going to pass it off to our artist of the day, who's Chim, who's going to lead us in some poetry before our next session. Is that we encourage you to download Zoom or update it for the best experience, which you can go to Zoom Update, you can Google that quickly, or it'll prompt you to do that if you leave the call. We'll put the link in for you to fill out the conference survey, which also lets you enter into receive a Lightbox package from our friends at Light, one of the CCEDNet members, which is a little gift from us after this. So be sure to fill out that survey, and also there'll be a final evaluation coming your way at the end of the gathering. Our next session is at 1 p.m. It's on who forgot to add pandemic to the logic model with Health in Common, and it's going to be some help with evaluation, figuring out this moment a bit, and some tips for understanding how we're reporting and talking about this. It's going to be a really interactive sort of training session. So there's actually going to be a limit of 30 folks who will be able to attend the session. So unfortunately, that will mean try and get here at 1 so we can let people in through the waiting room. And I know Health in Common will also be able to promote to other learning that they're doing in the community if you aren't able to catch that one. So I'm going to pass it off. People put the link to the entire program there. You can check out more. To Chimwemwe Undi, who's our artist of the day. And I hope Chim is on the call. Chim is a poet with work appearing in Brick, Border Crossing, Room Magazine, and others, and a CBC Future 40 recipient this year. So Chim, your poetry this morning was really impactful and so great to hear. So I'm delighted to pass it off to you again right now.
Hi, thank you for having me back. Can you hear me okay? Okay,
yes.
Great. Yeah. I'm going to read some more poems. Let me start my I've been writing through this pandemic a bit, and the epigraph or the phrase that's been stuck in my head is from Dion Brand's Ossuary 1. I lived and loved, some might say, in momentous times. Looking back, my dreams were full of prisons. This is erratum after Nikki Walschlager. Against novel misnomer, against etc. erratum apologia, against tumid oratory, against going sans attending, against echoes prescience, against unaccounting fractured calculus, against government God, against our briefly hoisted faces, their Vaseline and sweat glisten, against unmuffled murmur, against body to mean me, against listening and learning and trying to do better, against centering, circling center, against normal, against ordinarying, again rebellion from bellum, from bellyache surely, against certainty, against sickle, against blackened choir, against expendability, again whole begets holy, again plate fingers form duke, against fist or flesh or language, against logging in ledger, against countability, against sheet or fine fescue, river bound in dress yellow, against pale palms, dark fingers, against skin shifting on time's broad throat. The last time that I read that poem, someone asked what pale palms, dark fingers meant, and I was like, it's just this. It's very straightforward. This next poem, I have been sort of hacking away at for the better part of a year, or at least since it was announced that Portage Place Mall was going to be destroyed, and hence it's called On the Imminent Destruction of Portage Place Mall. Not a bomb, but leveled, still unkeeling, listless or lacking inventory, shortly nothing, shortly unmade, hearkening back to blondes on VHS, stockings named for favored subset of flesh, glitter rides the escalators churn, jingle dirges in the backlight, specter, backlight blue, geometrical, impossible, this edifice, the biggest thing to hit the city since the flood, flood displaced in meaning by a bigger flood, mall displaced in meaning by the flood of us, flood again, toxic metaphor begat by bordering, black and brownness, by bodies blued, bluing, made buoyant by the mass of us, liquid in our number. To be sure, us does not equal this keen city, nostalgic amnesiac, supplicant lustrated in silted water, 10-tented fingers, bricks for wagging. Us means something like my people, connotes a buoyant mass, joyous noise, gestures to uncle strangers in the food court, stuffing ears with courage, lies. In Dollarama, auntie compliments my accent, offers me her son, strained plaid polyester, Portage Place First Nation, which D says to mean something like my people. People made a demographic, disappeared from municipal imagination, struck like noon, inside exit doors locked into exterior walls, before unmaking return again to the blueness of the light, gossamer and permanent, to the trees, indoors at that, a room's early wonder, to these planters built for sitting, uniformed men imported from the suburbs to tell us not to sit, to the clock's bright mechanics, spiral torsions only visible coming down the escalator, blunt blade also promised better things. The trouble is how to build it. The blue unmade amidst mist and wind and unhurried anarchy. How to conjure house and universe. Even dexterous in this new split tongue, I am full of all the wrong language, full of little but language, lungs full of elsewhere's smoke. I am helpless before what can't be helped, mouth busied, retuning the questions. What beautiful thing has ever left me and returned? What else in the middle distance is burning? Oh, I forget how long that poem is every time I read it. I'll read one last, I think, maybe a couple more. This poem is called Grunthal, Manitoba, 2019. Shout out to Grunthal. A beautiful country so full of breath, the sky as wide open as a howling throat. My throat is wide open as a prairie sky, as blue, as hungry to ungive what's been taken. You can't give back what has been taken. Unname the place, named what it already is. Rename a place that was already named in language with altitude and implication. This language's altitude and implication, good for making art and telling lies. Good for making art on telling lies, for making promises it meant to keep. Made promises we had no means to keep. Renamed the place already named. Renamed the place already named. 64 clicks northeast of nothing. 64 clicks northeast of nothing. 95 clicks south of nothing. 15 miles southwest of nothing. A beautiful country because you still breathe. The form of that poem is taken from Jericho Brown. It's called a duplex. So there's sort of an echo built into the structure of the poem that I think is a very cool reflection of what it's like to live in your own bubble. The form of this next poem is a ghazal. It's called Ghazal for What Remains Green. Things are dying all around me. I am memorizing rules for a very long test. Drinking coffee, doing brunch, distant light, a blinking green. The Prime Minister's palms, crimson, Ferris stink. Backs black with oil, shoe polish slick. White teeth punctuated money green. Limbs yet unfurling, stood over yawning foreign felt. Spooked at unspecified specter, three-eyed me, toothed fear, belly green. Killed is a better word than dying, hand in hand sure but less passive. The earth didn't turn on blue back, auto butterflied, morning fading green. I walked to the Safeway, brought bags, bought organic, under sooted sky, sun and orange omened, the red phlegm, a faint, ill-fated green. What else to do but mourn, compost, inject chlorophyll, think too much about plastic straws, think less of reproduction, learn to shoot a gun. I think that's it for me for now. Thank you for having me, and I will see you later.